At the age of 24, Napoleon Bonaparte had been involved in his first major military engagement at Toulon. In the preceding years, he had, after being raised on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, been schooled in France as an artillery officer and proven himself to be an extremely capable, hard-working, and intelligent student. Now, after the French Revolution and the Terror had purged the French military of its aristocrats, there were now ample opportunities for officers with talent to rise up the ranks. But how far Napoleon would rise would not only astound both him and his family, but the entire world, as seldom in the annals of history has one born so low risen to such heights of greatness. In the late spring of 1794, a curious document arrived at the revolutionary government in Paris. It was written by an artillery officer from the Mediterranean island of Corsica, who had recently been promoted to become a brigadier general in the French army, on the back of his remarkable contribution to the capture of the port city of Toulon from a British and royalist-led garrison. The author of the document was confident enough of his abilities to advise the Committee for Public Safety in Paris on how they should be conducting the war against Austria and other powers in Western and Central Europe. Here he made clear his view that although France was at war with most of the great and middling European powers, its foremost enemy on land was Austria. A great amount rested on defeating the Habsburg state, particularly in the Alpine region and further south into Italy, where Austria had been the most influential power for some time. If Austria were defeated, the intrepid author of the military memorandum suggested Italy would fall to the French. To this end, he suggested that the Army of the Alps and the Army of Italy should be joined together with the purpose of launching a major offensive against Austria through northern Italy. If needs be, any offensive maneuvers against Spain over the Pyrenees should be delayed in order to divert the necessary resources towards the Alps and northern Italy. The document came from Napoleon Bonaparte, who was still shy of his 25th birthday, but who had grand ambitions to play a major role in any such war in Italy against Austria. As we will see, it was here that the reputation which he had begun to build at the siege of Toulon in the autumn and early winter of 1793 was expanded to make him one of the most powerful figures in revolutionary France. Following the end of the siege of Toulon in December 1793, Napoleon had been dispatched into the Piedmont region, which straddles the border between France and Italy today. He spent much of 1794 here, involved in military operations against Austria and its allies in regions such as the Kingdom of Savoy and the various Italian republics and small states which made up the region north of the Papal State. His growing political position was emphasized in his close ties to Augustin Robespierre, the government attaché to the Army of Italy and brother of the leader of France in all but name, Maximilien Robespierre. On Augustin's command, Napoleon was involved in a diplomatic mission to the city of Genoa in the summer of 1794, the purpose of which was to try to draw Genoa, one of the few states in Western and Central Europe which had managed to remain largely unaligned in the War of the First Coalition, closer to France. Just weeks later, Napoleon's older brother Joseph married Julie Clary, the daughter of a deceased successful businessman. Julie brought a dowry of 400,000 francs to the marriage, a minor fortune which finally solved the Bonaparte family's financial woes, which had cast a shadow over Napoleon's life for the previous 10 years. Yet, events elsewhere threatened to scupper Napoleon's ascent to power even as it was just beginning. While Bonaparte was in Italy in 1794, the Reign of Terror, led by the Committee of Public Safety, of which the Jacobin Maximilien Robespierre was the most prominent figure, continued apace in Paris and across France. Its remit was to root out any traces of anti-revolutionary sentiment and conspiracy across France, and it did so ruthlessly, arresting, trying, and killing over 16,000 people in the space of just over a year between the spring of 1793 and the summer of 1794. But by mid-1794, France had become tired of the excessive bloodshed and the monopolization of power by figures like Robespierre. A violent backlash ensued on the 27th of July, 1794, just days after Napoleon's journey to Genoa, when Robespierre was ousted from power and executed the following day in an event known as the Thermidorian Reaction, after the name of the month in the revolutionary calendar, running from mid-July to mid-August. This signaled the end of the Reign of Terror and the decline in the influence of the Committee for Public Safety, while the Jacobin clubs were generally wound down across France and the revolution shifted towards a more conservative position. However, in the months that followed, many French people came to understand that they had simply swapped one form of state violence for another, as the conservative reaction to the more radical period of revolutionary zeal resulted in new violence known as the White Terror in the year following the Thermidorian Reaction. The Thermidorian Reaction could have proved fatal for Bonaparte. He had been a Jacobin for several years by that time. This in itself was hardly an overly nefarious crime, as the Jacobin clubs had proliferated around France in the early 1790s, and hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen were similarly aligned. But during the Reign of Terror, Napoleon had become associated with the Robespierres and others tied to the government led by the Committee for Public Safety. Owing to this, he came under suspicion during the Thermidorian Reaction, and on the 9th of August 1794, 2 weeks after the violent overthrow of Robespierre and his allies in Paris, Napoleon was arrested at his house in the city of Nice in southern France. He was then taken to the nearby town of Antibes and detained in a military fort. Over the next 10 days, he waited anxiously as the investigations were carried out into his actions over the preceding year. This was a tense time for Bonaparte. The guillotine had been resorted to for all manner of trivialities in France of late, and there was no guarantee that the young Corsican general even needed to be guilty of anything to lose his head. But fortunately, he kept it. On the 20th of August, his jailers gave him the news. He was free to go. Napoleon's actions over the next several months varied as he tried to settle into the new political dispensation. He championed numerous schemes at the time, one being to invade and reclaim his homeland of Corsica, which had come under British rule earlier that year. This eventually materialized into an expedition in March 1795, led by Bonaparte, but the sizable fleet of 15 ships and 17,000 men was scattered by the British shortly after it left Marseille. Thereafter, he failed to find a significant posting, notably within the Army of Italy, which Napoleon viewed as the most important theatre of the war. This was in large part owing to his spreading reputation as an individual who was not simply a military commander, but someone with vaulting political ambitions. Unable to acquire a position, he headed for Paris, where he established himself in the early summer of 1795. Here, he would spend many months trying to acquire a position which he deemed sufficient for his ambitions, but with his reputation damaged by his associations with the Jacobin extremists, who had fallen from power as a result of the Thermidorian Reaction, this proved an almost impossible task. One possible posting for Napoleon in 1795 was to be sent to aid in the suppression of the last major rebellion within French territory in the west of the country. The Vendée region in western France to the south of Brittany and north of Bordeaux, and the Gironde, had been a hotbed of counter-revolutionary zeal since the early 1790s, with elements there favoring the Royalist and Roman Catholic cause. Much of the violence also stemmed from disaffection concerning the levée en masse, the new kind of military conscription introduced in France in the face of the invasion of the country by numerous powers in 1793. The revolt was compounded in the summer of 1795 by the Quiberon expedition, as British land and naval assistance arrived in the Vendée. It was in this context that Napoleon was offered a position as a commander of an infantry division that was to be sent to the Vendée. However, this was theoretically a demotion for him, as he would not act as an artillery general, but simply as an infantry commander. Therefore, he was adamant that he would not accept the position and feigned sickness, a decision which caused some consternation when his superiors were reluctant to believe him. In the interim, he considered various peculiar alternatives to life in the French army. One proposal being that he would be sent to Istanbul to help modernize the Ottoman Sultan's artillery divisions, while he was also on record as saying, almost certainly with a fair degree of irony, that he was considering joining the British East India Company. 1795 was also a momentous year in the War of the First Coalition, the war which had been raging across Western and Central Europe since 1792, as a major alliance of Europe's powers, including Austria, Prussia, Britain, the Dutch Republic, Spain, Portugal, and several smaller states in Italy and elsewhere, sought to crush the French Revolution. In the first years of the conflict, France stood almost entirely alone against this pan-European coalition, though it had survived the worst onslaughts on French territory itself in 1793 by mobilizing huge numbers of young Frenchmen for war through the Levée en masse, the first modern nation to introduce national conscription in this way. Accordingly, by the end of 1794, the French were not only beginning to press into the Piedmont and northern Italy where Napoleon had been involved, but had also pushed the armies of Prussia and Austria out of eastern and northern France, and were making steady strides northwards in the Austrian Netherlands, in what is now Belgium, while in the south, French forces had crossed the Pyrenees to strike at Spain in Catalonia and Navarre. 1795 brought unprecedented success for the revolutionary government. Early that year, they began an assault on the Dutch Republic. A blistering campaign in late January saw the towns of Breda, Dordrecht, and Utrecht fall to the French army. At the same time, revolutionary elements within Dutch society, who had been unhappy for many years with the country's decline as a European power throughout the 18th century, seized control of Amsterdam on the 18th of January. That very day, the most powerful figure in the Republic, the stadtholder, William V of Orange, fled from the country. The Dutch revolutionaries now proclaimed a Batavian Republic, named after the Batavi tribe, which had inhabited the region in Roman times. They quickly allied with the French revolutionary government, and in the days that followed, much of the rest of the Netherlands came under the control of the Batavian Republic. By the late spring, the Austrian Netherlands were completely under French occupation, and the new Batavian Republic was a firm ally of Paris, while revolutionary armies, which had begun to penetrate into Prussia's territories in western Germany, consolidated their control over the west bank of the River Rhine that spring. Faced with this dramatic shift in the military situation, many of the members of the anti-French coalition began to reconsider their involvement in the war. The result was the Peace of Basel, the name given to the three separate peace treaties between France and Prussia, Spain and the Landgraviate of Hessen-Kassel, a significant state in western Germany. Under its terms, Prussia agreed to make peace by ceding its territories on the west bank of the River Rhine in return for France relinquishing control of lands on the eastern side of the river, which it had occupied. Hessen-Kassel agreed to leave the war, making Austria's continued fight against France more difficult in the process, while Spain ceded its territories on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola to the French in return for the French withdrawing from northern Spain. Moreover, just months after negotiating the treaty, Spain agreed to begin providing naval aid to the French. As such, while the revolutionary government still faced a strong alliance led by Britain and Austria, by the autumn of 1795, Prussia and Spain had been knocked out of the War of the First Coalition, and the Dutch Republic had been transformed from an adversary into an ally. With this, there was no doubt that the French Revolution would now survive the threat posed by the other European powers, but it was also beginning to spread its beliefs to other parts of Europe. Despite its growing number of victories on the battlefield in the Low Countries and elsewhere, the revolutionary government in Paris and France still continued to experience periods of pronounced chaos and unrest in the capital. The White Terror and the conservative backlash against the Jacobins and the Reign of Terror had continued through late 1794 and into 1795. By the autumn of that year, tensions were building within the Parliament and the National Convention over the formation of a new constitution, with the Royalists and Conservatives within the Convention drifting towards the promulgation of a constitution which would allow for the eventual return to a constitutional monarchy. As well as this, the continuing revolt in the Vendée and fresh popular insurrections in towns like Dreux in northern France left many within the Convention feeling fearful for the future of the French Republic and the Revolution. A clash between the Royalist faction in Paris and the Convention and those who wished to preserve the gains made since 1789 was now brewing, and it began to come to a head early in the month known as Vendémiaire, the month in the revolutionary calendar running from late September through to late October. On 12 Vendémiaire, 1795, or the 4th of October as we would typically know it, the more radical element within the Convention, led by Paul Barras and other figures, ordered General Jacques de Bussy to begin preparing to confront armed royalist groups who were coalescing around Paris. However, de Bussy would prove ineffective, and this would lead to Napoleon's ascent within the revolutionary regime. Shortly after midnight on 13 Vendémiaire, or the 5th of October 1795, Napoleon arrived at the Tuileries Palace, where Barras asked him to take charge of the revolutionary forces. By that stage, as many as 25,000 royalists had amassed in Paris and the surrounding area, and were moving to surround the old royal palace. Against these, Napoleon was able to pull together about 5,000 troops who were faithful to the revolution within the city. He then told Barras that he intended to deal with the insurrection in his own manner, something which Barras consented to. His plan involved having dozens of cannon brought from Neuilly to the Tuileries and set up around the perimeter along with his Republican infantry. Then, at dawn, when the Royalists began to move forward to seize the Tuileries and power in Paris, Napoleon ordered his soldiers to open fire. The notorious whiff of grape shot remark, which Napoleon is alleged to have uttered as a euphemism for the cannon and musket shot which followed over the next hour, was most likely an invention of the Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle, writing some years later. In any event, the result was the same. By early morning, hundreds of royalists were dead around the Tuileries Palace. The rest had been scattered and were being hunted throughout Paris. While the attempted seizure of power by the royalists had been foiled, Napoleon was a hero, and his time in the political wilderness following the Thermidorian reaction was at an end. The events of 13 Vendémiaire were significant in other respects. In the early hours of the 5th of October, as darkness still cloaked the Tuileries, and Bonaparte was preparing its defences for the expected royalist onslaught, he had been approached by a young French cavalry officer by the name of Joachim Murat, who had volunteered to take a detachment of men to Neuilly and retrieve the cannon from the Comte de Sablon there and bring them to the Tuileries. It was the beginning of a long and close association between the pair, one which, eventually, would see Murat marry Napoleon's younger sister Caroline and be crowned as King of Naples in 1808. He was also a Marshal of the Empire and Admiral of France in later years. Murat's story was arguably the most prominent example of how Napoleon intensely rewarded those who were loyal to him in the 1790s and 1800s, and who rose to power with him. Eventually, his marshals, those men who went to war with him from 1795 onwards, would rise to become kings, princes, dukes, counts, and lords of much of Europe. In the aftermath of the events of 13 Vendémiaire, the new constitution, which had been worked out and adopted in the summer and early autumn of 1795, known to history as the Constitution of the Year III, was implemented. It had called for the disbanding of the National Convention, which duly occurred on the 3rd of November 1795. It was replaced by a bicameral parliament consisting of a lower house called the Council of 500 and an upper house called the Council of Ancients. The Council of 500 was the main legislative body and was elected by French males who were allowed to vote if they met certain wealth requirements. There was a rapid turnover of members of each house, with many being replaced every year. Yet power from November 1795 was primarily held by an executive body known as the Directory. The members of this five-man council were chosen by the Council of Ancients from a list of names which were presented to them by the Council of 500. Therefore, the membership of the Directory was theoretically controlled by the parliamentary houses. But once they were installed, the directors exercised huge power. The Directory would govern France for the next 4 years, until the early winter of 1799. Napoleon's continued rise under the Directory was assured by the fact that Paul Barras, the revolutionary who had sought out his assistance on 13 Vendémiaire, was the only continuous member of the Directory across those 4 years. The weeks after 13 Vendémiaire saw Napoleon's love life shifting rapidly. In the spring of 1794, he had begun a relationship with Eugénie Cléry, a sister of Julie Cléry, who his brother had married late that summer. Napoleon's courtship of Eugénie had continued into 1795, but she had largely remained in the south of France where she hailed from, and the long-distance nature of the relationship had led Napoleon to compose Clisson et Eugénie, a romantic novella, while they were apart. The subject of it was the doomed nature of a relationship between the main character, a French soldier, and his lover. Life imitated art, and Napoleon's relationship with Eugénie collapsed during the course of 1795. Instead, he began seeing Josephine Beauharnais, the daughter of a wealthy French sugarcane farmer who had owned a plantation on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. Josephine, who at 32 years of age in 1795 was 6 years older than Napoleon, had previously been married to Alexandre de Beauharnais before he was executed towards the end of the Reign of Terror. She subsequently began a relationship with Paul Barras before meeting Napoleon. By December 1795, he was writing to her of his passionate love for her, and just weeks later, in January 1796, he proposed to Josephine. The surviving letters between them in these early months point to Napoleon being completely besotted with his fiancée in the first months of knowing her. They were married on the 9th of March, much to the consternation of Napoleon's family, who were appalled that he had chosen to marry a woman 6 years his senior and who had 2 children from her first marriage. Napoleon, though, was unperturbed by this. Such was his infatuation with his new wife. However, in years to come, they would both engage in infidelities, and, as we will see, it was a complex marriage. There were 2 rings associated with Napoleon's engagement and marriage to Josephine. The first was a somewhat plain gold and enamel band, which he gave to his future bride on the occasion of their engagement. This was engraved with the initials N.B. for Napoleon Bonaparte, with a further inscription reading "Sincere Love" in French. This would go on to have an unusual history, with it later given to Empress Eugénie, the wife of Napoleon III, who would one day rule France during the middle of the 19th century. It is a clear statement of Napoleon's love for Josephine in the early days of their relationship, despite how complicated the marriage would become over time. A second wedding ring was a more elaborate affair, consisting of a sapphire and diamond on a gold band, one which must have cost Napoleon a significant amount of money to acquire in revolutionary Paris. The ring was subsequently passed by Josephine to her daughter Hortense, and from there passed through several members of the Bonaparte family in the 19th century. When auctioned in 2013, it sold for nearly $1 million. Josephine had married a man with many somewhat peculiar character traits. By the mid-1790s, Napoleon was increasingly known for being a superstitious individual. For one, he became convinced that his marriage to Josephine itself was lucky, perhaps on account of the fact that she had weathered the political crisis of the early 1790s rather well, despite her connections to many members of the old regime. He also came to believe over time that he was guided by a lucky star. In moments when things had gone his way on the battlefield or in the politics of the time, he was known to point out a star in the sky, which he had determined years earlier was his lucky star. This held true across his adult life, and even on St. Helena, after he had lost everything in the late 1810s, he was known to refer to it. Conversely, he was deeply suspicious of cats and would not have them around any house that he lived in or his palaces in later years, a result of a vestigial medieval association in Europe between cats and witchcraft. Finally, he was uncomfortable with doors being opened widely and often requested people to simply move them ajar sufficiently for them to enter when coming into the room he was in. In other ways, he had maintained the practices and personality traits which he had held in his youth in the French military academies and on Corsica. He remained a workaholic, for instance, throughout the 1790s and 1800s, often sleeping only for 3 or 4 hours a night. This was also reflected in his dietary habits, and Napoleon would typically request plain food like chicken and onions, which he would then eat quickly in the space of 10 or 15 minutes before returning to his labors. One of his few indulgences was long baths, which eased the pain he experienced regularly from both the skin infection he had picked up at the siege of Toulon back in 1793 and a case of hemorrhoids. While his whirlwind courting of Josephine was occurring, Napoleon was also laying the seeds of his next ascent within both the military and French politics. Prior to the Thermidorian reaction, Napoleon had developed ideas for how the military campaign in northern Italy should be carried out. These were ignored in the months that followed, as he found himself cast adrift politically from mid-1794 onwards. But his role in foiling the attempted royalist coup d'etat on 13 Vendémiaire had seen Bonaparte's star rise again. In this situation, he was able to successfully petition to be given command of the Army of Italy, which was floundering at the time, as French resources were primarily being directed towards the conflict in the Rhineland region of Germany. Thus, on the 11th of March 1796, 2 days after his marriage to Josephine, Napoleon left Paris to take up command of the Army of Italy. He would face an uphill task, as while the army numbered over 100,000 troops on paper, it was severely depleted with only 40,000 or so troops combat-ready. While in northern Italy and the wider Alpine region, the French faced not only the Austrians, but also the Kingdom of Savoy-Piedmont and the Duchy of Parma and Piacenza, with additional support coming from the Papal State and the Kingdom of Naples further to the south. Although his military career included numerous important engagements and successes by this time, notably at Toulon in 1793 and in Paris on 13 Vendémiaire, his command over the Army of Italy from the spring of 1796 onwards was actually Napoleon's first time acting as the overall commander of a major army. He had a difficult task before him. The Army of Italy was significantly outnumbered in the spring of 1796. Between them, the Piedmontese and the Austrians, the two foremost enemies Napoleon would face here, had some 60,000 men, compared to just 40,000 French soldiers, while the Austrians also had additional allies in the shape of numerous smaller Italian states, like the Republic of Venice, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and the Papal State further to the south. As well as this, the Army of Italy was badly supplied, with many soldiers lacking basic equipment and uniforms, while some of the divisional commanders were incompetents, who had been promoted either through nepotism or the sheer need for commanders of any kind during the frantic first years of the war. The only advantage which Napoleon had was that some of these obstacles were also issues within the Austrian army. Furthermore, the Habsburgs had a fatal sense of loyalty towards older military commanders, and the Austrian military was led in the main by generals who were in their 50s, 60s, or even 70s, some having started their careers during the 7 Years' War, which had been fought between 1756 and 1763. The decades in between had seen considerable innovations in military technology, with artillery and field ordnance evolving and the rifle replacing the musket as the standard issue firearm. Consequently, these veteran commanders' methods were generally outdated. Napoleon introduced a vital series of reforms in Italy, which were the key to much of his success in the campaigns of 1796 and early 1797. Within days of his arrival on the front, he solicited a loan of 3 million francs from some Jewish financiers in the city of Genoa, and then used this money to invest in the supplies and equipment of the army of Italy. He reorganized the divisions with the goal of eliminating social distinctions between the men, and he also removed a number of incompetent commanders from their positions quite quickly, replacing them with some of his own favored lieutenants. Others he simply won over to his cause and instilled in them the idea that they were going to win great victories for France in the months ahead. As Napoleon himself noted, a general's most important talent is to know the mind of the soldier and gain his confidence. And in both respects, the French soldier is more difficult to lead than any other. He is not a machine that must be made to move. He is a reasonable being who needs leadership. And leadership is certainly what Bonaparte provided. Commentators on his activities in the weeks after he took up command of the army of Italy noted his seemingly unlimited energies and ceaseless work ethic, sending over 800 letters and dispatches as head of the army before the end of 1796. Much of this focused on the minutiae of army command, such as having thousands of new pairs of shoes delivered to the front for his soldiers, and plentiful supplies of bread. Armies march on their feet and their stomachs, and men whose feet aren't sore and whose stomachs aren't rumbling fight better when they need to do so. Napoleon's micromanaging of such issues at a time when the concept of army logistics was still thoroughly underdeveloped in Europe was part of his genius. As well as these managerial, administrative, and logistical measures, Napoleon made some further innovations. He promoted a range of individuals to key positions who proved to be immensely successful in their new remits. One of these was Alexandre Berthier, an engineer who Napoleon made his chief of staff and who would serve in that position for nearly 2 decades. Joachim Murat had also accompanied Bonaparte to Italy as his aide-de-camp. Within a short period of time, he had been promoted to oversee the cavalry detachments of the army of Italy. In the coming months, his units were of significance as Napoleon relied on speed to defeat the numerically superior Austrians, eagerly ranging around northern Italy, often engaging the enemy multiple times per month in major clashes and darting between towns and cities. Part of the reason why he was able to do this was that Napoleon took the decision to act with a far greater degree of independence from Paris than was typical of a general at the time. Instead of delaying his actions on the battlefield by sending messengers back to the central government to decide on one approach or another, Bonaparte acted as though he was the supreme commander in Italy, both in terms of the military situation and eventually in negotiating peace terms with the smaller Italian states, in the process isolating Austria and facilitating his ultimate victory over the enemy. Not everyone within the Directory government was happy with the independent streak of General Bonaparte, but few could argue with the results in the months that followed. Napoleon's first task when he arrived in southeastern France was to tackle the Kingdom of Savoy-Piedmont, which controlled the border regions around what is now the Franco-Italian border. Savoy also held the island of Sardinia and was a naval as well as a terrestrial power in the region. The Piedmontese were aided by the Austrians here, but Napoleon managed to win 2 considerable victories in quick succession in mid-April, at the Battle of Montenotte on the 12th of April and the Battle of Mondovi on the 21st of April. Between these 2 engagements, the Austrians and Savoyards lost thousands of men, either dead, wounded, or taken as prisoners. Realizing he faced a much more considerable enemy in Bonaparte, King Victor Amadeus III of Savoy quickly agreed to an armistice at the town of Cherasco in late April, and peace talks were speedily furthered. On the 15th of May 1796, the Treaty of Paris was signed, whereby Victor Amadeus ceded the Duchy of Savoy and the County of Nice, his more westerly territories in what is now the southeastern corner of France, to the French. He retained his territories in northwestern Italy around the city of Turin and the island of Sardinia, but granted the French free military access through his lands, meaning that Napoleon could continue his advance into the plain of Lombardy in the early summer of 1796. With the Kingdom of Piedmont now eliminated from the war, Napoleon marched further eastwards with his army towards Milan. On the 10th of May, he scored a significant victory over the Austrians at the Battle of Lodi, allowing his forces to overrun the Duchy of Milan, which had been an Austrian territory since the early 18th century. Much of the war in northern Italy then began to focus on the siege of the city of Mantua to the east of Milan and south of Venice. A French force first entered the city on the 4th of July. Meanwhile, Napoleon moved about the wide region with a mobile army of some 20,000 men, for a time heading south into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. He won several important battles during these weeks, notably the Battle of Lonato on the 3rd and 4th of August, followed by the Battle of Castiglione a day later. In these, Bonaparte faced the Austrian general Count Dagobert Sigmund von Wurmser, a successful Austrian general with experience stretching all the way back to the 1750s and the 7 Years' War. He proved no match for Napoleon's modern tactics, and despite their forces being relatively equal, the French came away victorious from both engagements. Neither blow proved decisive, but each battle saw several thousand Austrian troops killed or wounded, and over the summer and early autumn of 1796, this attritional warfare slowly ground the Austrians down to the point where Napoleon was able to secure ever more territory across northern Italy. This pattern of regular engagements, which failed to result in a complete French victory, but which wore down the Austrians and reduced their numerical superiority, continued into the autumn. Further clashes at Rovereto and Bassano in the hinterland around Mantua on the 4th and 8th of September resulted in thousands of Austrian casualties, with much smaller French losses. What was more, with the defeat at Bassano, Wurmser had little option but to withdraw his remaining troops inside the walls of Mantua, where an outbreak of malaria and shortage of supplies were already devastating the Austrian garrison. A minor setback occurred for Bonaparte when his forces were marginally defeated by an Austrian army under Joseph Alvinci at Arcole, near Verona, in mid-November. But the decisive blow was struck at the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797. Here, in what was his greatest military victory to date, Bonaparte's forces staved off a numerically superior army led by Alvinci as it tried to relieve the siege of Mantua. What was more, after the initial fighting, the French pursuit of the broken Austrian lines resulted in the capture of over 10,000 Austrians. With defeat at Rivoli, Wurmser, who had been overseeing the defense of Mantua since withdrawing his own forces into the city the previous autumn, realized the Austrian situation was hopeless. On the 2nd of February 1797, he surrendered the city to Bonaparte. Napoleon was now master of northern Italy. With victory over the Austrians at Mantua and the surrounding area, Napoleon was fully in control of the plain of Lombardy in northern Italy and southwards towards Modena. Now, in conjunction with the representatives of the Directory in France, he organized these into the Cisalpine Republic, a sister republic of France which was organized as a vassal state along similar lines to the Batavian Republic in the Low Countries. This was to consist of 11 departments, such as Milan, Modena, Reggio, Cremona, Bergamo, Pavia, Lodi, and Como, with the new republic's capital at Milan. Valtelline, south of the Alps, also seceded from the Swiss Confederation, which it had been part of since the late medieval period, paving the way for future conflict between the French and the Swiss. Throughout this process, Napoleon was central to organizing the new state and appointing a 5-man directory which was appointed to rule it, in imitation of the French government. However, Bonaparte did not stop there. Having defeated the Austrians in northern Italy, he now determined to press home the advantage he had gained and proceeded into the older territories of the Habsburgs, which up until the time he had taken control of the army of Italy had been perceived to not be threatened by any French force. First, he secured his southern flank by speedily leading an army south to Rome in mid-February and forcing Pope Pius VI to accept peace terms, knocking yet another enemy of France's out of the war. He then turned back north and in early March 1797 led the reinforced army of Italy northeast towards Austria. On the 16th of March, he won a minor engagement with the Austrians at the town of Valvasson. Far more conclusive was the Battle of Tavis in late March in the region which straddles the triple border between Italy, Austria and Slovenia today. Thousands of Austrian troops and gun carriages were lost or captured here, and Napoleon now rushed forward, seizing the town of Leoben, lying just 75 kilometers from Vienna in early April. It was at this juncture that an armistice was agreed between the French and the Austrians. With victory in northern Italy and the incursion into Austrian territory in the spring of 1797, the government of Emperor Francis II in Vienna realized that they had more to lose than gain by continuing the war against France. Peace negotiations were initiated as this reality dawned on the Austrians. These eventually concluded in the Treaty of Campo Formio, which was signed between the French and the Austrian governments on the 17th of October 1797. The treaty was a resounding victory for France against its most bitter enemy in the War of the First Coalition, which had been raging since 1792. Through it, the entirety of the Austrian Netherlands, a region corresponding to modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and some of the border regions of northeastern France, was ceded to the French. A dispensation which, along with the creation of the Batavian Republic as a vassal republic of France in 1795, and the annexation of Prussia's territory in western Germany, effectively left the French Republic in control of Europe west of the River Rhine. To compensate Vienna, the Republic of Venice, a maritime trading republic which had been in existence for over a millennium, was dismantled. Austria annexed the city itself, and most of its adjoining territories in northeast Italy and what is now Croatia. France took several of its island territories in the eastern Mediterranean, including Corfu and several of the Ionian Islands, while French control over much of northern Italy was acknowledged as the Austrians accepted the existence of the Cisalpine Republic. But dominance of the region was still contested, and this, along with the unresolved issues in Germany, ensured that peace between France and Austria would not last long. Victory in Italy saw Napoleon turning his attention to looting the country's vast historic, artistic, and cultural heritage. This was part of the French revolutionary government's wider program of cultural theft and reappropriation during the 1790s. This was viewed as justifiable, as the revolutionaries believed they were creating a new modern society, one in which Paris would become the center of intellectual and cultural endeavor, and in which organizations like the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, eventually established in 1798, though planned for some time prior to this, were best positioned to look after Europe's cultural heritage. The process was first systematically undertaken following the conquest of the Low Countries and the Rhineland between 1794 and 1796, when countless works of art by figures such as Peter Paul Rubens and Rembrandt were auctioned off, and entire libraries and archives loaded up on carriages and transported back to Paris. We would call this theft today, but the revolutionaries viewed it differently, and their actions established a template for such behavior, which was followed by archaeologists, Orientalists, classicists, and scholars of Asiatic and African cultures throughout the entirety of the 19th century. Napoleon's earliest contribution to this process came in the looting of Italy. A commission was established here which followed in the wake of the Army of Italy to identify the cultural heritage of individual cities and towns. As a person of Italian heritage, Napoleon was particularly interested in their work. Some of what was plundered was agreed to with the defeated powers and defined in clauses of the Treaty of Campo Formio and other peace treaties. However, the commissioners did not stop there. Hundreds of paintings, thousands of other artworks and objects of historical and cultural significance, such as Roman coins and tens of thousands of books and documents, were looted and sent to France. Many were given to the government in Paris and would eventually be organized into collections within the city's museums and libraries. but others were sold to private collectors or simply appropriated by senior government figures who were in a position to claim such spoils of war. Many of these are well known. For instance, from Milan, the commissioners took some of Raphael's preparatory work for his famous painting of Plato and Aristotle, the School of Athens, as was the Codex Atlanticus, a series of drawings by Leonardo da Vinci bound into a book. This was also pilfered from the Milanese collections. Paintings by the Northern Renaissance painter Jan Bruegel were looted from Milan too, while works by Parmigianino and Mantegna, amongst others, were stolen from collections in Parma, Modena, and other northern Italian and Tuscan cities. Numerous paintings by Titian and Michelangelo were also pilfered. Napoleon was not opposed to benefiting himself from this program of cultural theft. In early 1797, he made his own personal residence in northern Italy in the ducal palace of Modena. There, his recently wed wife Josephine, who had arrived to visit him in Italy, took an interest in the extensive collection of cameos and precious stones which had been collected for hundreds of years by the Este family, one of the most significant patrons of the Italian Renaissance. She took about 200 of these items into her personal possession, and it was not simply that figures in France and Italy were intent on robbing the peninsula of its cultural heritage. Often they were damaging it irreparably. In Venice, the Bucintoro, the ornate state barge which was used to celebrate the annual marriage of the sea between the Republican government and the Adriatic, was taken apart, with some of the sculptures sent to France and the rest of the boat burned. The famous wedding at Cana, a painting of the biblical scene produced by Veronese in the early 1560s, was sawn in half in order to send it back to Paris, where it eventually ended up in the Louvre. Many parts of the Arsenal of Venice, decorated with ornate gold statues and silver and bronze items, were melted down. In Rome, the commissioners had considered breaking into pieces the column erected by the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century to commemorate Rome's conquest of Dacia in modern-day Romania, in order to transport it to Paris. Luckily, they decided it would cost too much, and it still stands intact in central Rome today. Thus, Napoleon's conquest of Italy resulted in extensive looting of its cultural heritage and irreparable destruction to much of it also. After the Treaty of Campo Formio had been finalized, Napoleon determined to head back to Paris. He had become an increasingly politicized figure while in charge of the army of Italy, founding 2 newspapers while on campaign to manipulate public opinion surrounding his actions, while he had also sent aid to Barras, Charles Talleyrand, and other members of the Directory government in the autumn who had secured additional control over the government through the coup of 18 Fructidor. He left for Paris himself in early December and arrived in the capital on the 5th of December. Back in the city, the extent of his political rise was apparent to anyone with eyes and ears. On the streets of Paris, random people and soldiers called out to him that he should make himself ruler of France. Such was the popularity of the conqueror of Italy, who defeated so many of France's enemies after 5 years of unpopular rationing and conscription. Yet Napoleon was wary. He was not powerful enough yet to seize control of the government, and many within the administration were suspicious that he might try to establish a dictatorship. The Directory received him cordially, but coldly, troubled by his ambitions, while also criticizing the manner in which he had acted in Italy without consulting Paris on very many important matters. Such standoffs aside, there was no doubt that Napoleon was now the foremost military leader of France. Napoleon's victory in Italy, the defeat of Austria, the power which had first led Europe to war against revolutionary France, and the signing of the Treaty of Campo Formio had effectively brought the War of the First Coalition, which had been raging for half a decade, to an end. With separate peace agreements having been negotiated with the Dutch Republic, Prussia and Spain in 1795, and the bulk of the Italian states defeated during the course of 1796 and 1797, only Britain remained as a major antagonist of France. For a time, the war consequently declined in intensity, and it is this gap between the autumn of 1797 and late 1798 that historians typically see as a period of general peace, marking the time between the War of the First Coalition and the War of the Second Coalition. Yet France was never reconciled with Britain, and even during this year-long period, fighting continued between the two nations, most notably in Ireland, where the Directory sent thousands of French troops in the autumn of 1798 to aid the United Irishmen in a revolt against English rule of the island, though one which was ultimately unsuccessful and quickly suppressed in October of that year. Plans were also being discussed in Paris throughout this period concerning a potential invasion of Britain itself. These would remain central to French strategic plans, and Napoleon would return in the 1800s to the idea of trying to conquer the old Anglo-Norman enemy across the English Channel. In late 1797, and even into 1798, there were still plans being considered to launch a major amphibious invasion of Britain, with Napoleon considered the best candidate to lead the expedition. Shortly after he returned to Paris from Italy, he met with an Irish rebel leader, Wolfe Tone, to consult about a possible invasion using Ireland as a base of operations. But this all changed in the early spring of 1798, as Bonaparte convinced the Directory of a new, enormously ambitious military endeavor, one which, if successful, would ensure Napoleon's legacy as a modern-day version of his hero, Alexander the Great. The plan was to lead a major naval expedition to Egypt, occupying the region and then using this as a springboard to a subsequent military campaign into Asia, with the ultimate goal of wresting control of India from Britain. The plan was not as implausible as it might seem. Though the British, through the East India Company, were the preeminent colonial power in India, France had long been a rival of Britain's there, and still had diplomatic ties to major Indian rulers such as Tipu, Sultan of Mysore, who wished to ally with the French against the British. In light of this, plans for a French occupation of Egypt to provide a route into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean beyond had been under consideration by French governments since the 1770s. Now Napoleon aimed to make a reality of these ambitions. The view in Paris was that if Britain could be deprived of its Asiatic colonies, it would be crippled financially and would be no match for France in years to come. With this rationale in mind, the Directory acquiesced in Napoleon's ambitious plans early in 1798. By the late 1790s, Egypt had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire for over 2.5 centuries. The Ottoman Turks had once been one of the most formidable empires in the world, ruling over a vast area which included modern-day Turkey, the Balkans, North Africa, the Levant, much of the Middle East, and north into the Caucasus and the northern shores of the Black Sea. In 1683, Sultan Mehmed IV's armies had almost seized Vienna. But in the century that followed, the Ottoman Empire had stagnated and declined, whereas Europe had entered into a period of unprecedented scientific, technological, and military development. As a result, it was widely believed that Ottoman Egypt would not prove difficult to conquer, while it was hoped that a military conquest might not even prove necessary if popular support could be acquired and Napoleon was able to present himself as a liberator from Turkish oppression. Yet even if this proved possible, there was a significant threat posed by the British Royal Navy, which would do whatever it could to try to cut Napoleon's supply lines back to France in the Mediterranean Sea. It was in this context that Napoleon and the Directory government began creating early in 1798 the Armée d'Orient, or the Army of the Orient. In total, the expedition was to consist of 40,000 soldiers and roughly 10,000 mariners, along with several hundred transport ships carrying men, horses, and extensive supply trains. Secrecy in preparing the army and sending both men and supplies southwards to the port of Toulon, near Marseille, was paramount, as the Army of the Orient would only be guarded by about 24 battleships and frigates as it crossed the Mediterranean, and it was imperative that information about the expedition be kept from the British. Speed was also of the essence, and so the entire endeavor was prepared within weeks and Napoleon was ready to sail by mid-May 1798. He might have been ready to depart from France earlier had fears of a renewed war with Austria not led to a delay. In Toulon, in early May, he met with the senior generals who would accompany him to Egypt, which included Louis-Alexandre Berthier, one of Napoleon's closest allies, who had been with him in Italy in 1796 and 1797, and Jean Lannes, a junior officer who had served with Napoleon in Italy and who Bonaparte now personally selected to accompany him to Egypt. Napoleon's growing nepotism was also evident, as his younger brother Louis accompanied the expedition as a lieutenant of the 4th Artillery Regiment. The Egyptian expedition sailed from Toulon on the 19th of May 1798. 2 days earlier, a French ship had been captured by Horatio Nelson, a rear admiral of the British Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, leading to details of Napoleon's goals being revealed. As a consequence, the expedition left southern France with Nelson beginning to scour the western Mediterranean for the French fleet, hoping to intercept it before it reached Egypt. Having left Toulon, Napoleon's ships made a brief landing at Corsica, the first time Bonaparte had returned to his homeland in over 4.5 years. It was a fleeting visit, and the Armada left within days. From Corsica, they proceeded south and east. Nelson was focusing his attentions on the waters along the western coast of Italy, but Napoleon's fleet was steering a more westerly course towards Malta. They arrived on the island on the 9th of June, 1798. The Order of St. John, a medieval religious military order, had held the island since the first half of the 16th century, seeing off sieges by the Ottomans and other powers over the years behind their vast fortifications at Birgu and Valletta. But Napoleon's army and fleet proved one siege too many, and on the 11th of June, the island fell under French occupation. Not wishing to waste any further time while Nelson and the Royal Navy were in pursuit, Napoleon left Malta in mid-June and hurried across the Mediterranean. The expedition landed near Alexandria at the Nile Delta on the 1st of July, capturing the city the following day. In the days that followed, Napoleon and his sub-commanders began fanning out across the north of Egypt and preparing to make their descent southwards towards Cairo. All the while, proclamations were issued alerting the population that the French were there to liberate the country from Ottoman oppression and the rule of the Mamelukes, the powerful Muslim warrior aristocracy which had ruled Egypt since medieval times and which exercised a great degree of autonomy from the Sultan in Istanbul. These Mamelukes had largely allowed the French to seize the north of the country and were amassing further to the south around Cairo to resist Napoleon's army of the Orient there. On the 12th of July, Napoleon began his move towards Cairo. On the 21st of July, they met the Mamluk army led by the two co-rulers of Egypt, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, on the Giza Plateau outside Cairo. The exact location of the battle was a site called Mbabe, but with the fighting taking place adjacent to the only surviving wonder of the ancient world, it is more typically referred to as the Battle of the Pyramids. Over half of the 40,000-strong army of the Orient were arrayed here against a Mameluke force of somewhere around 6,000 Mameluke cavalry and over 15,000 infantry. In his pre-battle orders, Napoleon exhorted his troops to save Egypt from barbarism and English domination, claiming, quote, "From the top of those pyramids, 40 centuries are contemplating you." Then the French advanced in 5 divisions in rectangles, with the cavalry at the center and the artillery on the wings. The latter proved highly decisive when the two armies clashed, as the Mamluks, while they had been a formidable army in medieval times, were archaic in their methods by the late 18th century. Their Mamluk forays against the French lines were repeatedly repelled by French rifle fire, while their cannon pummeled the Mamluk infantry lines. Within a few hours, the Mamluk army had been decimated, with thousands killed or wounded next to a few hundred casualties on the French side. With victory in the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon victoriously entered Cairo and assumed control over Egypt. While the Battle of the Pyramids seemed to indicate swift success for the Egyptian expedition, it was followed soon after by disastrous news from the north. As Napoleon and his officers and technicians were settling into ruling the country from Cairo, Nelson had finally struck with his Mediterranean fleet against the French Armada in the Nile Delta. The Battle of the Nile, or Battle of Aboukir Bay, took place over 3 days, from the 1st to the 3rd of August, 1798. On the 1st of August, Nelson's fleet arrived. His 14 ships of the line did not outnumber the French, but the Royal Navy was the greatest naval force on earth at the time, and the French were caught off guard. Consequently, within a few hours, several of the French ships were sunk, including the French flagship, the Orient, and 9 were captured. The fighting continued intermittently across the Nile Delta for the next 2 days as the British tried to hunt down the remaining French ships. Only 2 French ships of the line and 2 frigates escaped from Nelson. With this, the French expeditionary fleet was effectively destroyed. Napoleon and the Army of the Orient were now trapped in Egypt, with their supply lines and lines of communication back to France cut off. Following this debacle, Napoleon established himself in Cairo. With his lines of communication with France cut, he was freed from having to take directives from Paris and the Directory. As ruler of Egypt, he commanded his troops to respect the Muslim culture they were embedded in, and there was even a suggestion that Bonaparte contemplated converting to Islam, though this would certainly have been a political move designed to engender the support of the Egyptian population had it materialized. Egypt benefited during this period from the extension of many of the scientific advances Europe had experienced over the 17th and 18th centuries, while many of the liberal values of the French Revolution were introduced into the country. During this time, his troops were sent further up the Nile to conquer the rest of the country. The tax system was also reformed, and newspapers began to circulate around Cairo for the first time, many of them designed to extol the virtues of French rule and, of course, Monsieur Bonaparte as the ruler of Egypt. But not all went smoothly. In late October, the French faced a serious uprising in Cairo, though it was suppressed with the use of French guns. Overall, this period of Napoleon's career was significant, as it provided a period in which he effectively governed a country. As such, it was an apprenticeship of sorts for his subsequent rule of France and then of his European empire. There are other elements to Napoleon's time in Egypt and Cairo in particular which attest to his eclectic personality and modern nature. Though raised as a Roman Catholic, he had largely abandoned organized religion himself by the time he entered his 20s. Nevertheless, he displayed a highly conciliatory approach to his Muslim subjects in Egypt and was known to have a high regard for the Prophet Muhammad, doubtlessly because of the vast Arab conquests which Muhammad initiated and which placed him on something of a par in Bonaparte's eyes with his other great heroes, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He took measures beyond this to ingratiate himself to his Egyptian hosts. For instance, he made appearances at 3 of the most significant religious and cultural festivals in Egypt, the festivals of the Nile, of the Prophet, and of the Republic, held in short order in August and September each year. At the Nile Festival, a pagan event which had its origins in pharaonic Egypt, canals containing the floodwater of the Nile were opened to initiate the inundation of the river's banks with rich alluvial deposits ideal for farming. At this festival, Napoleon made efforts to present himself as a benefactor of the Egyptian people. Equally, at the festivities of the other 2 festivals, he invited a wide range of Egyptian leaders to a banquet and had food and other items dispersed to the common people of Cairo. All of it was a great public relations program, but it also points towards the magnanimous nature of Bonaparte when ruling a non-European and non-Christian people. There was little such open-mindedness amongst the colonial administrators of British India or the Dutch Cape Colony amongst others at the time. The Egyptian expedition was not solely a military endeavor. At the behest of Napoleon and other senior political figures in Paris, The Commission des Sciences et des Arts was established in March 1798 as a scientific and academic branch of the expedition. It originally comprised of 167 members, of which approximately 150 were to accompany Napoleon and the Army of the Orient to Egypt. Amongst these were dozens of engineers and mathematicians, with many geographers, historians, Orientalists, artists, linguists, writers, and publishers as well. The 18th century had witnessed the first great emergence of Oriental studies, and now the expedition was viewed as an opportunity to study one of the oldest civilizations in history. The scientific and cultural aspects of the expedition would eventually become the greatest success of the endeavor. They massively expanded access to the printing press in Cairo, while the first preliminary engineering studies for the construction of a canal between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea were also carried out. But the greatest achievement was in the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, a large stone tablet found near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta in July 1799. This 2nd century BC extensive stone inscription contained the text of a royal decree in both ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek, and provided the basis for Jean-François Champollion to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics in the years that followed, forming the basis of the discipline of Egyptology, the study of ancient Egyptian history and culture. As the winter of 1798 turned into the spring of 1799, the Ottomans began amassing their forces in the Levant, in preparation for an offensive against the French in Egypt. Napoleon decided to preempt this attack and instead launch an offensive of his own northeastwards into what is now Palestine, Israel, and Syria. His forces left Egypt in early February, occupying Gaza later that month. But this was the high watermark of Napoleon's military campaign in the Near East. In early March, he laid siege to the city of Jaffa. Here he met with much sterner resistance than had been expected. The same was true of attacks at Cana and Acre in April. What was worse, the Turks and the British were now closely coordinating their efforts to resist the French advance northwards towards Lebanon and Syria. Nevertheless, what really brought a dismal end to Napoleon's campaign into the Levant in the spring of 1799 was an outbreak of the plague amongst his troops. This was catastrophic for Napoleon's ambitions, as without clear lines of contact back to France, his position could not be reinforced, and his forces were significantly depleted. Hence, although he won a major victory over the Turks at the Battle of Mount Tabor on the 16th of April 1799, he had to abandon the siege of Acre in May and begin withdrawing his forces back to Egypt. Napoleon returned to Cairo in mid-June. By now, although his lines of communication with Western Europe were severely hindered, he was receiving news that France was back at war with the vast majority of the European powers. With the opportunity of a general needed in Europe and his Egyptian expedition having run into such trouble that it could never realistically achieve its goals of opening a French route to India through the Red Sea, he determined to return to France. This placed him in the thorny position of abandoning his post, as following the destruction of his warships at the Battle of the Nile, he could not return to Europe with the bulk of his army. Instead, he appointed General Jean-Baptiste Kléber to take charge of the remaining army of the Orient, which by the summer of 1799, owing to combat losses and the plague outbreak in the Levant, was reduced to under half its initial complement of 40,000 soldiers. Napoleon departed with a small fleet of 4 ships on the 23rd of August. In Egypt, the French presence was maintained for a year and a half longer, though Kléber was assassinated in the summer of 1800, highlighting how reviled the French had become in Egypt, and eventually, in the early 1800s, the Ottomans resumed control of the country. What remained of the Army of the Orient was repatriated to France. While Napoleon was in Egypt and the Levant, a new pan-European war had erupted. The War of the Second Coalition, as it is known, had commenced in the final weeks of 1798. France had never made peace with Britain after the War of the First Coalition, and it began to find new and old allies alike during the course of 1798, notably in Russia, which had remained aloof from the War of the First Coalition. However, Tsar Paul I had been perturbed by Napoleon's capture of Malta in the summer of 1798, Paul being the honorary head of the Order of St. John. Fears of French aggression had been further stoked in the spring of 1798, when the Swiss Confederacy was overrun by French troops and the Helvetic Republic was created as the latest sister republic of France, named like the Batavian Republic in the Low Countries after a tribe which had inhabited the Alps in Roman times. Meanwhile, Austria and several smaller Italian and German states were anxious to resume the conflict and recover lands lost in 1796 and 1797. Therefore, during the course of the second half of 1798, an alliance between Russia, Austria, Naples, and of course Britain began to emerge, while the Ottoman Empire was now opposed to France as well, following the invasion of its empire by Napoleon. For its part, France had ambitions of expanding further into Germany and Italy. It was allied with Spain when the War of the Second Coalition broke out in the final days of November 1798, while the Batavian Republic and several newly created Italian republics also joined the French alliance. Napoleon arrived back in Paris on the 16th of October 1799. He found the political situation much changed from what it had been when he left to take over command of the Army of the Orient in southern France a year and a half earlier. Despite demanding enormous financial indemnities from the European states that it had defeated between 1795 and 1797, the Republican government was teetering on the brink of financial ruin, as the cost of renewed warfare mounted from late 1798. Heavy taxation and the resumption of the levy en masse conscription made the Directory government extremely unpopular, and there were fears of a new invasion of France itself by the various powers allied against the country. Into this environment, Napoleon returned to a hero's welcome. His absence in Egypt and the Levant had benefited him greatly, allowing Bonaparte to disassociate himself from the unpopular Directory. Instead, despite the general failure of the Egypt expedition, Napoleon was viewed as the conquering general of 1796 and 1797 in Italy, now returning to once again save the Republic in a time of renewed war. It was this popularity and public impression which would allow him to begin seizing absolute power in France from late 1799 onwards. Yet he would have to contend with a new force in doing so. On the 18th of June 1799, known as 30 Prairial in the revolutionary calendar, as Napoleon was in Cairo plotting his return to France, a coup had occurred in Paris. This followed elections during the spring, which had seen hundreds of new members enter the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, who had more radical leanings than the general membership in previous years. These have been characterized as effectively being neo-Jacobins and politicians whose sympathies lay with the more radical revolution, which had been in progress between 1792 and 1794. On the 17th of June 1799, they objected to the election of Jean-Baptiste Treilhard, an anti-Jacobin figure, as a member of the Directory, and had him replaced with a pro-Jacobin figure, Louis Gohier. The following day, on 30 Prairial, the more radical Jacobin element effectively seized power within government, while Emmanuel Joseph Seyss, a prominent revolutionary figure since the halcyon days of 1789, and a major intellectual who is viewed as a pioneer of the social sciences, was effectively promoted to become the most prominent figure within the government. In the historiography, the events of 30 Prairial are identified as a coup, though a bloodless one. They paved the way for Napoleon's subsequent seizure of power upon his arrival back in France, as they had reduced the influence of the moderate Directory before Bonaparte ever returned from Egypt. Napoleon began plotting to seize absolute power in France as soon as he reached Paris in mid-October. He was facilitated in doing so by a number of factors. Firstly, Emmanuel Sées was already plotting an additional coup to solidify his faction's control over the government. Secondly, Napoleon had numerous allies with senior positions in the government who would facilitate his claiming power. Foremost here was his younger brother Lucien, who was president of the Council of 500, the lower house of the French legislature, a position Lucien was conveniently appointed to on the 23rd of October, a week after Napoleon returned to Paris. In the final days of October and into November 1799, Bonaparte then began conspiring with Sées, on the surface claiming that he wished to further Sés's ambitions, but in reality planning to utilize Sées and his followers to help him secure power himself. Napoleon moved on the morning of 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, what we would know as the 9th of November 1799. That morning, Lucien Bonaparte brought claims to the Council of 500 that a new Jacobin coup was imminent. This invented insurrectionary threat was then used as the pretext for placing Napoleon in charge of the city's military forces. With these forces, Napoleon began securing government buildings across central Paris. Simultaneously, several of the members of the Directory resigned, including Sées and the ever-present Paul Barras, who had called on Napoleon's aid to save the revolution from the very real royalist threat 4 years earlier on 13 Vendémiaire. With the resignation of several Directory members, that body could be said to have ceased to function, opening the way for Napoleon to step in as the executive power in the city. However, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500 were not as easily swayed and refused to disband, meeting again the following day, 19 Brumaire. This was the moment for Lucien to once again play a major role. As the Council of 500 were giving serious consideration to a motion to outlaw Napoleon and declare him a traitor to the Republic, Lucien left the chamber and engaged the soldiers outside, declaring that enemies of the revolution were attempting to terrorize the members of the lower house and arrest his brother. Lucien then drew his sword on Napoleon and said he would plunge it into his own brother if he was a traitor. This was the moment at which matters changed as the soldiers agitated to enter the chamber in which the Council of 500 was meeting. Led by Joachim Murat, Napoleon's faithful ally ever since the morning of 13 Vendémiaire, when he had volunteered to bring cannon from Noyer to the Tuileries Palace, they entered the chamber and dispersed the council. With this, the Parliament was effectively disbanded, and with the collapse of the Directory the previous day, the government was no more. Napoleon had seized control of France in a bloodless coup. In the hours that followed, the plotters established 2 commissions which were charged with establishing a provisional government. These quickly determined that in the short run, France would be run by a consulate consisting of 3 powerful ministers. This was modelled on the triumvirates of the late Roman Republic, the first being one where Julius Caesar had shared power with Pompey the Great and Marcus Crassus, and the second triumvirate, largely led by Octavian and Mark Antony, with Lepidus as a junior partner. It was surely not lost on many people, at a time when people knew their classical history far better than they do today, that the second triumvirate had ended with Octavian declaring himself to be Caesar Augustus and establishing the Roman Principate, which we now term the Roman Empire. In the hours after the consulate was established, Napoleon was declared to be the first consul, or head of the consulate, while Sées was appointed as second consul, and Roger Ducos, another former member of the Directory, as the third consul. Yet Napoleon had no intention of sharing power with Sées, who had plotted the coup with him from the beginning. Just over a month later, in mid-December 1799, Sées and Ducos were removed from the consulate and replaced by Napoleon with Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambaceres, a political moderate who had negotiated many of France's peace treaties between 1795 and 1797 during the final years of the War of the First Coalition, and Charles-François Lebrun, a political conservative who was known for trying to foster collaboration amongst individuals of opposing political views throughout the 1790s. In choosing de Cambaceres and Lebrun as the second and third consuls, Napoleon was putting in place individuals who could not possibly become rivals for power. Thus, although there was the appearance of a continuation of the Republic following the coup of 18 Brumaire, in effect, Napoleon, like one of his heroes, Julius Caesar, following his victory over Pompey back in the mid-1st century BC, was ruler of France in all but name from November 1799 onwards. To better legitimize his seizure of power, Napoleon and his closest allies determined in the days following the coup of 18 Brumaire that a new constitution should be promulgated. This would be the third constitution decided on for France in just over 6 years. Although, unlike the constitutions created in 1793 and 1795, this was a short document, which was not really designed to revolutionize the French political system, but only to cement the new dispensation arrived at following the coup. Thus, it contained none of the revolutionary concepts around the rights of French citizens, which had been central to the two previous documents. Many of the terms were borrowed from Roman language, and so the senior political offices were to be consuls and tribunes. The legislative bodies were reduced in size from the Council of 500 and Council of Ancients established in 1795. For instance, the legislative body was reduced to 300. In order to lend a veneer of further respectability to his seizure of power, Bonaparte held a plebiscite on the ratification of the Constitution in early February 1800, the results of which, in a forerunner of the 20th century dictator's playbook, were heavily falsified to make it appear that 99.94% of those who had voted had done so in favor of the Constitution of the year 8. Yet, these dubious electoral strategies aside, there is no doubt that Napoleon was a popular leader of France as he settled into his position as first consul. Ludwig van Beethoven was a great admirer of his and dedicated his Third Symphony to the new leader of France, while some prominent British political figures, such as Charles James Fox, felt relatively positive about the possibility of peace in Europe after years of war, now that Bonaparte had seized power in Paris. While the coup of 18 Brumaire and the rubber stamping of the new consulate government through the creation of the new constitution had seemingly brought Napoleon to power in France, his position was still tenuous, at best, as 1800 began. Many individuals had risen to positions of great power in France over the past decade, only to fall from grace in short order. This included Robespierre and powerful members of the Directory like Paul Barras. Ultimately, if a figure could not successfully prosecute the wars against France's enemies at any one time, he became unpopular and quickly lost his grip on power. Napoleon was more than aware of this and knew that he could only cement his grip on the nation if he speedily brought the war of the Second Coalition to a successful conclusion. With that in mind, in the spring of 1800, having assembled a significant force, he headed southeast towards Italy, the scene of his greatest victories in 1796 and early 1797. Here, the Austrians were preparing to invade France, having gathered upwards of 100,000 men in the plain of Lombardy under their general Michael von Melas. Napoleon determined on a new strategy, taking control of the French reserve army stationed in Burgundy in the east of France and heading over the Alps and through the new Helvetic Republic with them, much as one of his great heroes, the Carthaginian general Hannibal, had done to strike at Rome at the start of the Second Punic War in 218 BC. Napoleon would later make great propaganda use of this action, with the acclaimed painter of the Revolution, Jacques-Louis David, painting Bonaparte crossing the St. Bernard Pass into Italy atop a stallion, whereas in reality Napoleon crossed over the Alps astride a pack mule, and a small group of Austrian and Piedmontese soldiers made such a spirited defense of the mountain passes over the Alps that Napoleon's planned surprise descent into Italy was completely foiled. Napoleon's Italian campaign of 1800 has become synonymous with one particular engagement, which occurred not long after he descended into northern Italy in the early summer. The Battle of Marengo took place on the 14th of June 1800 in the Piedmont, approximately 70 kilometers to the north of Genoa. Napoleon's forces of nearly 28,000 men were only marginally outnumbered by the 30,000 soldiers led by the Austrian commander Michael von Melas. But the Austrians did have a major advantage in terms of the size of their artillery train, with Napoleon only having 15 large cannon at his disposal, while von Melas had upwards of 100. To add to his woes, Napoleon was caught off guard when von Melas engaged in a surprise attack on the French forces spread out in the region at 9 a.m. on the morning of the 14th. Owing to this, the Austrians were in a very advantageous position by the early afternoon, and General Claude Victor Perrin, who was in charge of the French divisions on the left flanks, had to fall back in the face of Austrian gunfire. At this juncture, the result of the battle seemed so clear that General von Melas left Marengo to inform Emperor Francis II of Austria, who was at the nearby city of Alessandria, that he had defeated the French. Von Melas's overconfidence was a factor in his defeat. The other factor was Napoleon's bold intervention in the battle. Seeing Victor's men retreating, he and General Louis Desaix gathered the remaining cannon together and galvanized their forces for a counterattack. Charging directly against the Austrian center lines, they unleashed significant damage on the enemy, though not without great danger. Desaix himself was shot through the heart and killed, but the charge which he had led turned the tide at Marengo. In the hour that followed, the Austrian lines broke under the French assault and began to flee, many being killed as they slowly gathered around the Bormida Bridge, the only crossing point to their rear. By the evening, Napoleon was in charge of the field of Marengo. His forces had suffered considerable casualties, with over 6,000 men either killed, captured, or wounded, but the Austrians had fared much worse, particularly in the later stages of the battle after Desaix and Bonaparte's counterattack. Upwards of 6,000 had been wounded or killed, while the French captured 8,000 men in the chaotic retreat by the Habsburg forces. Marengo was Napoleon's greatest victory to date, though one which owed a huge amount to Desaix's brave counterattack in the early afternoon. With his latest victory over, and the Austrians assured by the Battle of Marengo, as well as a separate success at the Battle of Hohenlinden in Bavaria in southern Germany by General Jean-Victor Marie Moreau, peace negotiations between France and Austria commenced in the final days of 1800, as Emperor Francis II informed King George III of Britain that he was no longer able to keep his country at war with the French. Several weeks of talks culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Lunéville on the 9th of February, 1801. Despite the Austrian defeat in the War of the Second Coalition, this new treaty only reiterated many of the terms agreed through the Treaty of Campo Formio back in 1797. For instance, French control of the Austrian Netherlands and territories to the west of the River Rhine were reiterated, as was Austrian control over Venice and Istria and Dalmatia in what is now Croatia. However, Lunéville forced Austria to demolish many of its forts in Germany, weakening its presence there in the event of a future war, while Vienna also had to formally acknowledge French control over the Ligurian and Helvetian republics, while also tolerating the extension of French power further to the south in Italy into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, while many of the ecclesiastical states within the Holy Roman Empire, which the Austrian Habsburgs had been emperors of for centuries, were secularized in line with the French revolutionaries' antipathy to organized religion. With the signing of the Treaty of Lunéville, the War of the Second Coalition, which had started while Napoleon was absent from Europe in Egypt, was coming to a gradual conclusion. In October, Napoleon managed to negotiate peace terms with Russia, whereby both nations generally returned to their diplomatic position prior to the war, though a secret clause included a promise of alliance in future between Napoleon and the new Russian Emperor Alexander I. This was facilitated by the assassination of Tsar Paul in St. Petersburg earlier that year. Matters with Britain remained more antagonistic. In April 1801, a Royal Navy fleet entered Copenhagen in order to force the Danes into a promise that they would not ally with the French and provide them with the use of the considerable Danish navy. That summer, the Spanish, with French support, invaded Portugal, one of Britain's few remaining allies. All of this indicated a further extension of the geographical sphere in which the war was playing out, as France no longer had to concentrate on Italy and Germany. But with Russia's exit from the conflict in the autumn, the government of Prime Minister Henry Addington in London finally agreed to enter peace negotiations after nearly a decade of continuous war with France. Napoleon assigned his brother Joseph the task of negotiating with the British chief diplomat in the ensuing talks, Marquis Charles Cornwallis. These were concluded in late March 1802, when the Treaty of Amiens was signed. Under the terms of this, the British government finally recognized the legal validity of the French government following the overthrow of the monarchy nearly a decade earlier. The main terms between France and Britain involved simply the establishment of peace and the repatriation of the many prisoners of war which the two nations had taken over the past 10 years of conflict. The more important terms concerned their allies. For instance, Napoleon was anxious that the Batavian Republic, France's first major sister republic in the Netherlands, would have the Cape Colony at the southern point of the African continent returned to it, as it had been taken over by the British in 1795, when the Dutch switched sides in the War of the First Coalition. In return, the British were confirmed in the possession of Sri Lanka, known as Ceylon at the time, which had also been a Dutch colony since the 1640s, but which had been occupied by the British. The French agreed to withdraw from Malta, and in return, the British pulled out of Egypt, where they had established a presence following Bonaparte's unsuccessful expedition. In Italy, Napoleon had to agree to setting the southern limit of French control in Tuscany. As well as this, the independence of both the Papal State and the Kingdom of Naples, the latter of which had been one of Britain's most stalwart allies since 1793, were acknowledged by the consular government in Paris. Finally, France's ally Spain agreed to relinquish the Caribbean island of Trinidad to the British, but in return, the Balearic island of Minorca was restored to the Spanish after nearly a century of British rule there, since the War of the Spanish Succession at the start of the 18th century. From all of this, we might say that the Treaty of Amiens established that neither Britain nor France had lost the near decade-long conflict they had engaged in since the beginning of the War of the First Coalition. With the end of the War of the Second Coalition and the peace terms he had secured with Austria and Britain, Napoleon's ascent to power in France was confirmed. It had been a tumultuous road he had travelled on in the 1790s. A hero after Toulon in 1793, he had fallen from grace within months, as his associations with the extreme element within the Jacobins, and the Robespierres in particular, had seen him arrested in the summer of 1794. Unlike many others, he survived the purges of the White Terror. But his career was floundering throughout 1794 and 1795. That is, until the events of 13 Vendémiaire and the attempted royalist coup offered him the opportunity to prove his worth to the regime. Thereafter, under the new government of the Directory, he was given overall command of the Army of Italy. His military brilliance did the talking from there, as he defeated the Austrians and reduced much of northern Italy to French rule. Even a potentially fatal misstep in undertaking the Egyptian expedition in 1798 proved advantageous when it allowed him to distance himself from the Directory government, which became increasingly unpopular while he was absent from France. Consequently, Bonaparte was able to seize power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799. This grip on power, though, could have been ephemeral. After all, figures like Robespierre and Paul Barras had attained positions of immense power in revolutionary France, only to fall from grace when they could not stabilize the nation and achieve victory in France's wars. As such, it was only when he was able to instill confidence in his leadership by roundly defeating the Austrians at Marengo, and then bringing the War of the Second Coalition to an end with extensive French gains, that his position as leader of France was secured. It was around this time that Napoleon is believed to have said to one acquaintance that a throne is only a bench covered with velvet. But in the months that followed the end of the War of the Second Coalition, Napoleon would be tempted into crowning himself as master of France and then of Europe. What do you think of Napoleon's rise in the 1790s? Was his expedition to Egypt an act of complete folly, or was there a plausible strategic reason for it? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.